and the UK or Switzerland and the Netherlands. But I have some question about whether experts really are expert about this in identifying those barriers, and whether experts in 2008 reporting what was the problem in 2000 are not in part rationalizing the events that later occurred, because I do not doubt that there was a large increase in treatment seeking. But there was a large increase in treatment seeking throughout much of Western Europe during this period. And part of it has to do with the aging of the heroin addict population, which has occurred in most of Western Europe and in the United States. What we see here in Switzerland, not so much the UK, certainly the Netherlands, I think in Italy as well, is evidence that the population of heroin dependents mostly initiated heroin use in the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And since at least the year 2000, that population has steadily been getting older and has been more likely to seek treatment. And I suspect that Portugal, a laggard in this respect, and I mean laggard is merely descriptive, not pejorative, a laggard in this respect, is now seeing that same end of heroin epidemic, aging, treatment seeking by its heroin-dependent population. In general, much of what is recorded here by way of sort of improvement in the drug situation, I think is consistent with what's happened to many other Western countries. Cannabis use has declined amongst youth in most Western countries since about 2000. You know, what you see across many countries is an increase in cannabis use amongst youth through the 1990s, and then an ending and a decline, sometimes quite substantial decline, starting sometime between 1998 and 2002. In Australia, the most recent household survey shows youthful cannabis use down by about 1/3 from its peak in 1998. For the US, it's less than that, but it's down noticeably. UK, it's certainly down by 20% over that period. It does not, it doesn't threaten the central conclusion, which is that decriminalization did not lead to a substantial increase, but it reminds you that these policy changes occur in the context of large changes in youth culture. I mean, I am convinced that popular culture is a much more important influence than any policy measure with respect to cannabis use. I wouldn't make the same claim about cocaine and heroin, but these, you know, anything that happens in Finland and Australia can surely only be linked by, I mean, maybe by extremes from the equator, but that's particularly implausible. I think, you know, popular culture is the story about what goes on with drug use. So when trying to explain changes in drug use patterns, I would put policy in the second rank of factors that you should look at. Now, that sounds quite cynical, but it's in fact very supportive of decriminalization. Because what it says is that if decriminalization reduces the intrusiveness of the state and inequality, and I'll get to that in a moment, and has very little consequence for drug use, then what's the argument against it? And in country after country, not just in the United States, it's clear that decriminalization criminalization of drug possession has had disparate effects on vulnerable groups. In the UK, I think the arrest rate or the incarceration rate for drug possession for migrant groups is something like 10 times that for natives. Even nice countries like Sweden turn out to have similar patterns. So there's a lot to be said for decriminalization, even if, you know, it does not have the benign consequences that might be inferred in Portugal. It has there's no evidence of negative consequences, and that's really all you need for these purposes, with a caveat of worrying about net widening. Do I have 2 more minutes? 2 minutes. We then get to the question of, would it work here? Now, I was earlier this week in Australia, and it was wonderful to have a contrast of a country which I grew up in, where there's the colonial cringe. Everywhere else does it better than we do it, so we always learn from other countries. We couldn't possibly be a leader in anything. And come back here where we couldn't possibly learn from elsewhere since we are the leader in everything. But sort of putting that aside, the question is, how do we learn from other countries? And I think it's important to see, the experience in Portugal as sort of one more piece of evidence. It doesn't prove anything. It's one more piece of evidence that helps move us towards a which helps strengthen the argument that decriminalization would not have any serious would have minimal adverse consequences and very substantial desirable consequences. And again, I think that's all we need from this, and I think it's wonderful that we now have a clear and well-written and well-disseminated study of Portugal, because I think we can, with respect to drug policy, learn a lot from other countries. Thank you.
Okay, before we open it up for questions, we're going to give Glenn Greenwald 4 minutes to respond to anything that's been said. We are running a little bit over, so...
Yeah, I'll be very brief so we can maximize the time for questions. Just a couple points. First, I appreciate the concession, which I think the evidence compels, that decriminalization has not led to any of the problems that decriminalization opponents predicted. And I think once that is the central concession that can really and should really transform drug policy debates, that if decriminalization won't lead to an explosion of drug usage and might even enable usage rates to decrease, then there is no conceivable rationale for continuing to devote enormous amounts of money to the criminalization scheme and imprisoning and encaging huge numbers of our fellow citizens, because there is no rationale to criminalization. And as I said, I think that's the central myth that drives virtually every drug policy debate in this country. As far as the intrusiveness of the state is concerned, I think it's probably true that there is some degree of intrusiveness, ongoing intrusiveness, from being brought into an administrative hearing. But I think anyone who's ever been involved in a criminal proceeding before, where you're charged with committing a crime, where the court can judge you guilty of committing a crime, where you likely have a criminal record, where you need a lawyer, where you go back repeatedly, where a prosecutor is pointing at you and accusing you of wrongdoing. The intrusiveness of that process compared with going on a one-time basis, 72 hours after receiving a citation, to sit with 3 people who offer you treatment and can't really do much more to you than that. The gap between those is, I think, rather substantial and not minimal. And lastly, I just want to address this question of whether drug usage rates in the EU have actually been declining during this period, rendering Portugal's decline not particularly remarkable. Again, I think there's always some statistical ambiguity, but at least according to the European Monitoring Center for Drug and Drug Addiction, which is set up by the EU to be the centralized agency to collect drug data. And if you look at page 20, there's a chart that demonstrates this, that in most areas of drug usage for EU member states, the amount of drug usage has actually increased rather substantially during this period. And on page 21, it indicates that the annual report of that agency says that, quote, drug use in general remains at historically high levels, but it has stabilized in most areas. It says for cannabis usage, current levels are by historical standards very high. And on page 22, it indicates that for cocaine, it is estimated that in 2007, 4.5 million Europeans used it, up from 3.5 million the year before. And then finally on page 23, it shows on a EU by EU member state basis drug usage rates for 16-year-olds for cannabis. And on page 26, it shows the same statistic for cocaine. And what it shows is that for most EU member states during this period, drug usage is increasing during that 2001 to 2006 period, often precipitously, putting, I think, into context Portugal's stabilization and in many important cases, its decline. So with that, I will turn it back over to Tim for questions.
Okay, we're going to open it up and take your questions now. I do have 3 requests. When I call on you, please wait for the microphone to come down so that everybody can hear your question. Please identify yourself and any affiliation that you may have, and please keep the questions brief so we can get to as many people as possible. We're not going to allow any 3-part questions today. Eric Sterling.
Thank you, Eric Sterling, Criminal Justice Policy Foundation. Can you tell us, Mr. Greenwald, about cultural factors involved in prevention? What were they? What are they? Is this only results in changes in law and no cultural changes involved that affected these different outcomes in drug use?
Well, I think it's hard to quantify. I can give you some impressions that I have from the work that I did. I think that the extreme levels of poverty in Portugal meant that there was a substantial portion of the population disaffected and feeling disenfranchised from the government. And when they're targeted with police action and criminalization, that is exacerbated. And when there's an effort to then transform the relationship between the government and its poorest segments, I think that transforms culturally how the citizenry in that segment perceives of the government. I also think, though, that what has, according to policymakers, been the most substantial cultural difference is that they now, instead of having all their money go to criminalization and imprisonment and the like, offices within the drug agency in Portugal are now very well funded to do things like do educational campaigns aimed at schools regarding drug usage and treatment. They were particularly proud of this bicycle race that they had where I think 15,000 citizens from Lisbon came, and the idea was they were going to bicycle and in testament to the benefits of health as opposed to the way in which drugs degrade the body. And so they feel like they can transform how these issues are discussed culturally as a result of the greater latitude that they have in their relationship to the population and especially the much greater resources that they have. There may be things in the specific to the Catholicism of Portugal, or Dr. Rutter referred to the political history of living under a dictatorship that may have affected one way or the other how they responded. I think those things are harder to quantify, though.
Yes, ma'am. Right here. No. Down here. There you go.
Jean Montgomery, I understand what you're saying about the decriminalization. I understand that the trafficking is still illegal, and also understand that Portugal is a relatively small part of the worldwide market, probably. So is there any evidence that the street price of drugs is any different in Portugal, or that there's less of a flow of drugs into it? Are they still spending money on interdiction?
Yeah, I don't know of any evidence to suggest that the market has changed as a result of decriminalization, primarily because of what you just identified, namely that trafficking is still criminalized. And I think they felt that they had no choice but to keep it criminalized. There's this phrase that European policymakers use to define what the consensus of Europe is with regard to drug policy, which is GBE, global, balanced, evidence-based. And the global aspect of that is premised in the belief that efforts to reduce supply and to engage in interdiction in order to be effective has to be done globally. And if there's any countries that are lax, let alone acquiescing to drug trafficking, that adversely affects not just that state, but all states. And so they've kept trafficking criminalized. The statistics show that actually convictions for trafficking has increased slightly since decriminalization. And so I doubt that there's much of a disruption one way or the other, either benefiting the drug flow or undermining it. I don't know of any evidence that suggests there is, because the relationship to drug trafficking has remained essentially the same.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Jesse Single from the Center for American Progress.